So I've been living in the Algarve now for just over a year, and these are the things that I still can't get used to today. So when I first arrived in Portugal, I found it really strange and unnerving how quiet it could be at times, especially in the off-season and the winter. Town centres could be completely quiet, no one around. It felt really sort of quite apocalyptic in some ways, and yeah, very strange. Bad roads. The Algarve can be pretty mixed in terms of how well the roads are maintained, with many of the smaller roads and some of the bigger ones, including the toll motorway, having areas with potholes or bad surface. Roads to the beaches can often be dirt tracks and only suitable if you really don't care about your car. In towns they can be pretty narrow and sometimes cobbled as well, and you have to watch out for pedestrians on the road and sometimes even on the pavements in narrow streets. And I've been in some pretty interesting situations driving down some of these narrow roads. Cold water. So when I first arrived here in the Algarve, I assumed that the sea would be quite warm, and it really isn't. In the middle of the summer it can be okay, but certainly not what you would call warm, and nothing like the Mediterranean or the Caribbean or anything like that. So even though the water can look really beautiful and really inviting, it's quite often pretty cold, and there's a reason why you don't tend to see that many people in the water unless it's a super hot day. Now I really like swimming, and my way around this was to get a decent neoprene top, which really helps keep the cold away and allows you to spend just that little bit longer in the water. And I can't recommend it enough. And if you're in the Algarve or coming to the Algarve on holiday, I definitely recommend getting at least a 1.5mm neoprene top, or even a shorty wetsuit, and you'll just enjoy your time in the water so much more. If you arrive without one, you can just pick them up in Decathlon, same with wetsuits, pretty cheaply, and yeah, definitely a worthwhile recommendation. Small beers. So in the UK we're pretty much used to drinking pints in pubs, and you kind of get frowned on if you order anything else. However, typically here in Portugal, most Portuguese people would order the Imperial, which is about 200 millilitres, and what we would call a small beer. Now, it does actually make quite good sense, and you might be thinking, so what's the point? But actually on a hot day, if you keep ordering these small beers, they stay cold and fresh, and you don't end up with that horrible beer at the end of a pint, where it's all warm and horrible. They actually do make a lot of sense. And the Portuguese tend to not be weird with the pricing, so like a small beer is kind of half the price of a large beer, and you're not paying at that premium which you tend to pay in the UK. Typically you can pick up a Sagres or a Superbock for €1 to €2, depending where you buy it from. And as we're talking about beer, it's also worth mentioning it can be cheaper than water quite often, especially in the supermarkets, which kind of makes no sense. Slippy and dangerous pavements. So you want to make sure you've got some decent grip on your shoes, or you'll probably quickly find out if you don't. Most towns have these smooth mosaic pavements which are often uneven and can be very slippy in both the dry and the wet. I've slipped over many times just wearing my normal trainers, and you really have to be careful about when walking around. Whilst on the subject of pavements, there are lots of roaming cats and dogs, and you really need to look where you're walking. Abandoned and rundown housing. So you'll probably notice when you come over to the Algarve that there's quite a lot of shabby or abandoned buildings, and even the odd hotel ruin or half-built apartment complex. This is largely down to the complex inheritance laws, and that most of the young people in Portugal tend to live abroad. Some of these buildings are pretty horrible and make eyesores in some lovely places, but some are actually really nice. Got some good graffiti on them sometimes, and actually make quite interesting photography subjects. So it's not all bad. The price of cars. So the price of cars in Portugal is actually some of the highest in Europe, And in fact, if you're looking to buy a second-hand car, something small like a Fiat 500, which you'd probably pick up in the UK for a couple of £1,000s, that could easily go here for 3 or 4 times that amount. It's not uncommon to see old cars selling for thousands and thousands of euros, and something you probably wouldn't even want to be driving in. If you're coming to live out in Portugal, just be aware that you might not be able to get the same standard of car that you're used to driving in the UK, and it's going to cost you a lot more, especially for bigger cars. Bigger cars here, and especially SUVs, 4x4s, tend to go for an even more premium price. So yeah, you need to be very careful about thinking about buying a car here. Slow pace of life. So things over here tend to happen quite a lot more slowly than in the UK, and it can take a bit of getting used to. For example, it's not unusual to wait quite a while for service in a restaurant, although you do tend to get asked straight away if you want a drink, and quite often before you've even seen a menu, which can be quite confusing to us British people. You'll often find people chatting in random places, and this can be driving in the middle of the street, a queue in the supermarket, and there's little sense of urgency in getting things done. But again, this is just the Portuguese way of life, and you just need to relax and get used to it. This also applies to pretty much any form of bureaucracy or anything that requires filling in a form or sending to the government, from visas to buying houses. The process just takes a long time.